Welcome to another CEO Wisdom Pod. We have Travis Chappell with us today. He is CEO of Guestio, Slide Cameo, but for interview bookings. He's host of a top 25 business podcast called Build Your Network, live from Las Vegas, Nevada. I'm from Montreal, but in Oaxaca, Mexico today. And yeah, we're going to have a fun time talking about Travis' background, his empire that he built in the podcast industry and podcasting, which is one of my favorite topic to talk about ever. This pod is brought to you by these guys, Qualia. If you want to optimize your brain, uh, Qualia, I take it for focus, memory, drive. As a busy entrepreneur, helps me run my business better. You can go to neurohacker.com/CEO wisdom. Travis, welcome to the pod. Tell me a bit more about yourself, what you're up to nowadays.
Charles, what's up, dude? Thanks for having me, man. Yeah, you pretty much nailed it. I'm a podcaster, and then I run a business that connects podcasts and guests together, guest to podcast, podcast to guest, all that good stuff. um, in my spare time, I like to be active, go to the gym, go for runs or hikes or whatever else, play some golf, attempt to play golf anyway. More like ball hunting and drinking, depending on who I'm going with. And then I got a wife and two kids, so they keep me busy as well, man. So lots of stuff going on.
And you have talked with so many high performers, Shaquille O'Neal, John Lee Dumas, Rob Dyrdek or Drydeck. Always forgot how to pronounce his name, Grant Cardone, and a bunch of cool people, Molly Bloom. What have you seen in common through those people? Like, what's the DNA of the high performer?
There's a combination of things. One of them that is pretty common amongst all of them is the ability to handle rejection. People that perform like that, it's just, I don't know if it's in their DNA or if it's something that's learned over time, but it's clear that they all seem to have that. That it's almost impossible to be successful long term without finding the ability to go from rejection to rejection without loss of enthusiasm for the next opportunity. And all those people have that. The other thing I would say is delayed gratification would be another one of those things that's a common denominator with all those people, is that most of those people have a tendency to look into the future at the big thing that they want to accomplish, and they're willing to say no to small things now that might be more quote unquote pleasurable or whatever in the short term, but not get them the results long term that they want. And so the people that I've talked to that have outsized success, they also tend to be able to delay gratification infinitely into the future, it seems like. So yeah, those are a couple of things. There's obviously several others, but those are a couple of the main ones that I've noticed.
How do you get all of these guys on a pod in the first place? What's the reason for them to come and be open, vulnerable, and share all their life's details to the world?
That is a good question. I, I don't really know for them what the incentive is. Some of them anyway. Like obviously some people, there's an incentive because I have an audience and they want to get in front of that audience. But people like Shaq, people like Rob Dyrdek, it's not like their personal brand's going to be blown up from my show. You know what I mean? So, yeah, that's a good question for some of them. It's frankly one of the things that I still ask myself, that I still question myself. I'm just like, why do these people say yes to me? I'm just like a random guy with a podcast. But for whatever reason they do, and I'm really happy that they do, because I've been able to have some awesome conversations with really, really great people on the show over the years. But yeah, my best estimate of why is that, I don't know, dude. People like that tend to care more about legacy. They tend to they tend to be in that step of the hierarchy of needs, and the legacy step. They've already done a lot of the other things that most people are still kind of in the midst of. And So I found sometimes it's actually easier to go get people who are much, much more successful than you are to come on your show than it is to get somebody who's like barely more successful than you are, or like one or two steps ahead of you, because they still have this kind of competitive nature that almost makes them want you to not be as successful, and therefore they think that they're more important, so they don't want to bring you up them. When you get to like a certain level of person that you interview, like they don't care about any of that. They just want to help people who seemingly have, you know, ambition, who seem to almost remind them of who they used to be when they were on the come up as well, and they want to give back. So I don't know all the reasons, to be honest with you, man. It still blows my mind to this day, but that's my best estimation of why somebody would choose to spend time with me on a podcast when, you know, they're a billionaire or whatever.
What's the strategy of the pod? Are you going broad? Are you going more after entertainment, more business, more education? Because you have such a diversity of guests.
Yeah.
I'm seeing Brandon Novak here talking about Bam Margera, which is, yeah, like part of my childhood, by the way. You have Zach Justice, Dr. John Jackwish, Vince Young. I mean, yeah, there's a bunch of people. So is the goal to get as much views and value to your listeners? Like, what's the broader
Yeah.
podcast strategy?
Yeah. So the show is now called Travis Makes Friends. It used to be called Build Your Network. For almost 5 years and like 800 episodes, it was called Build Your Network. And it was very niche specific. And I followed all of the marketing advice. You know what I mean? Like, if you want to build an audience, pick a niche topic and go deep into that topic, interview the best people around, talk to them about that thing, become known as the person who talks about this thing. You know what I mean? But after like 5 years and 800 episodes of talking about networking, I just got so bored with it, man, to be honest with you. So, if I'm being totally frank, at this point, I know I'm violating all of the rules of like having a podcast or growing an audience or niching down. I know that. And even when I'm coaching other people, I tell them not to do the thing that I'm currently doing. But ultimately, it got to the point where my podcast started, and then I grew a business on the back end of that podcast. And then the business model switched around COVID time because it shut down all of our live events business. And that was when we started developing the software. Well, the business stopped depending on the podcast to generate revenue for the business. And so when I realized that like I was creating all this content around a topic that I wasn't like super passionate about, it was just kind of a gap in the market that I was filling. And then it wasn't like leading to a certain business result. It was just like, why am I doing this? I'm so bored with it. It's not driving, you know, certain, you know, traffic, warm traffic to our offers really much anymore. It's kind of like, it's not really the same thing. So all I know is this. I know that podcasters who like, it's impossible to have a really successful podcast if you stop podcasting. That's all I know. So at some point, I would like this show to be my full-time thing. But if I am so bored with it that it becomes a drag on my energy, there's no way I'm going to stick with this thing for another like 2 3 months, let alone another 3 4 years. And so, yeah, we did a big rebrand at Travis Makes Friends from Build Your Network, brought into the scope of the people that we were talking to. It's much more casual conversations. I brought on comedians, actors, people like Dane Cook, podcasters like Zach Justice, athletes like Shaquille O'Neal and Paul Pierce, and former president of Mexico came on the show once. Like, so just been able to talk to a much more broad swath of people. And frankly, the only real measurement for whether or not somebody comes on the show at this point is just like, is it interesting to me? Is like the only way I can say it. Cause we get a bunch of people reaching out for guests all the time, you know, and I tell them no. And then they're like, okay, well, you know, what kind of guest are you looking for? And I'm like, I don't know. Just, you know, send whoever you got. And if it ends up working out, it ends up working out, because at this point, I just don't like, it's hard for me to fake interest in a conversation that I'm not interested in having, if that makes sense. And so now it's much more around like, okay, this sounds like a really interesting conversation. It's kind of off the wall and kind of weird. And I probably would have said no to it like 2 3 years ago, but sure, this seems interesting. You know, like this past week, I did 4 interviews in a 2-day time period in Dallas. The first one was with a guy who invented something called fallow fill. It's quite literally he's called the dick whisperer because he quite literally invented this like filler that can be safely injected into the penis to increase the girth and all this stuff. And his stuff is blowing up right now. He's been on a couple massive podcasts. And now it's being like they're making a lot of money, as you can probably imagine, as like the first safe procedure recommended by urologists and all this other stuff. And I was like, that sounds like an interesting conversation. Sure, let's have the conversation. How did you get into doing this stuff? You know what I mean? Like that was an interesting conversation to me. The second one that came in was the founder of GameStop, who obviously, that went public. And then he started a cosmetics line that he sold to Neiman Marcus for quite a bit of money. And then he was hired by Kinko's to be the CEO. He came into Kinko's. They lost 15 million in EBITDA the year before he joined the company as a CEO. The year after, they did over 100 million in EBITDA, and then increased yearly for the next 3 years, and then sold to FedEx for $2.4 billion. And so he's just a savage businessman, an entrepreneur. And then he just wrote a book, so I had him on the show to talk about all of that. And then I had a viral social media girl who grew her Instagram from 0 to over 500,000 followers in 60 days for her company, a branded Instagram account for her company that grew their sales by 800% in 60 days for a beverage brand. So I brought her on. She did a collab video with Gary Vee at the end of the campaign, like all this crazy stuff that happened. So I brought her on and we had that conversation. So those were 3. And then the fourth one the next day was with a guy named Daryl Eves, who's the founder of Vid Summit. He's Mr. Beast's video consultant who's been working with them since Mr. Beast was at like 3 million subs. Watched him and helped them get to 200 million. He's the executive producer of The Chosen, which is the largest or the most funded crowdfunding campaign of all time for a television show. Just this past season was a $55 million season they produced. It's being seen by millions of people. So he's the executive producer of that. So there's 4 interviews. Almost none of them have anything to do with each other. They're all wildly kind of eclectic, weird, all over the place. But they were all interesting to me. And so I get to have conversations with people who are interesting to me. And you can tell in the interviews how much more interested I am, which I think makes the content that much better. And then the people that I get to meet doing that are just really, really cool people to add into like my kind of Rolodex or my quote unquote network. That's how you want to say it. And then that's just kind of how I look at it, man. It's like, and then I know that if I'm curious about these things, other people are. And I hope that over time, if I can remain consistent enough, that the audience will kind of re-engage with the new mission, which is basically Travis makes friends. I'm going to go out and make friends with really interesting people. And I'm inviting the audience along for the ride to like be the fly on the wall for these conversations. So, hopefully it goes well. We'll have this conversation in 5 years. Maybe we'll have over 1 million subs on the channel.
There you go. Yeah, I'm bullish on you and everything that you're doing. How do you get in touch with these people? Where are their emails listed? Some of them on YouTube, some of them on Insta, some of them you're doing DMs, I guess. Tell me about how you reach out to these folks.
Yeah, you nailed it, dude. It's all of the above. If we can find email, we use email. We use Instagram DMs, Twitter or X, Facebook, warm introductions from people that I know who know them, going to events, meeting people in person where I know they're going to be. All of the above. We pull out all stops. You know what I mean? There's not just one way to make it happen. I will say I've probably had the most success in Instagram DMs over everything else. But that might just be because I personally like Instagram as a platform, so I use it most. I don't know if that has anything to do with people's response on it necessarily, but I tend to use that more than any other platform. So that might be the exact reason why. But yeah, I've gotten more success there probably than any other outreach tool.
So lots of serendipity. You consume someone's content and then you're like, oh shit, I want to talk to that person. I want to meet them.
Yep.
You follow them on Insta. You write a message. Hi, I'm Travis. I'd love to have you on my podcast. Here's some stats about my podcast. Here's what we
Yep.
would discuss about. That takes you probably 5 to 10 minutes to write. You send, and you hope that 1 out of 3 responds.
More or less. I do a video. If it's on Instagram or social media, I'll do a video. I won't record a 4 minute video. I'll do like a 30-second video, and then I'll drop some more info below. Like I say that at the end of the video, like I'll drop some more info below if you want to check out some of the other stuff. And then I'll type out some other things because I want to make it as easy as possible for them. But I also like, if you're good on video, which anybody who creates content like you or me for a living, like you're going to have an advantage on video. And sometimes I'll even sit here like in this seat with my microphone in front of me and my TV behind me and hold up my phone, even though obviously the audio is going through my phone, it's not going through here. It's just to like give them the perception that like, okay, this guy is at least taking this seriously. There's a level of professionalism about him. He looks clean cut. He sounds articulate. You know what I mean? Like it's stuff that you can't duplicate with just text. And especially now with AI and all this stuff that's automated, I want people to know that I'm personally reaching out to them. So like the very first thing I say in the video is like calling them by name. I'll say something specific about the piece of content or something that caught my attention recently. And then I'll say, you know, my name's Travis. I run a show called Travis Makes Friends. I'll drop some more info below and maybe we can have a conversation sometime. And then I'll go into more of the specific, you know, like, hey, here's some of the guests that we've had, you know, here's how long I've been around, here's the downloads and, you know, whatever else information I think is relevant for them to make a decision. But the goal is to get them to make a decision right then and there in the DMs. If they have to go out, like I've found that especially busy people, man, they're never worried about the things that you think they're worried about. The only real thing that busy people are worried about is time. Are you going to waste my time? So my job in my reach outs is to convince them as quickly as possible that I will not waste their time. And if I don't give them all the relevant information in the DMs, that means they got to go do more research outside of the DMs. What does that do? That takes more of their time. So that means they're much less likely to say yes because they're much less likely to go do further research, enough research for them to be able to come back confidently and say, yes, for sure, I'll do your show. You know what I mean? So I'm trying to get them as much information as I can without giving them a book to read in their DMs, so that they can make the decision right then and there without having to go do a bunch of further research, and bog down their schedule. Cause that's like theft for a busy person. You know, it's like stealing their time is real theft.
Right. And that's the challenge, not to make a book out of it, because there's some analytical people that want a lot of details. I'm guessing most of these stars are not that analytical. They're pretty much gut decision makers themselves. That's how they got there. But some of them will also outsource you to their agents. How do you make sure that this doesn't happen and that they take a decision on the spot?
Yeah. So the big thing for me is credibility pieces. So if I'm on a particular platform, I'll go to that platform and see who they follow, who I've already interviewed, and I'll list out everybody who I think that they would already know, like, and trust. People who they've done business with, people who've spoken at their events, if they host an event, people who've been on their podcast, stuff like that. Now I'm lucky enough to have people like Shaq and whatever, like where it's like, I know with a relative degree of certainty that pretty much anybody I reach out to is going to be familiar with who that is. You know what I mean? Even if they don't follow him. But yeah, I'll list out as many of those names as I can. That's the only time that I'm bloated in my reach outs. Is like everything else, I'm very, very lean, and I don't take a lot of time to say something that can be said in 5 words. I'm very brief, but the one thing that I allow myself to go nuts on is the people that I've interviewed, because like I said, sometimes it's just a punch in the face of credibility, man. Like when I drop 18 names, it's like 1 or 2 is like, okay, whatever. But if I drop 18, 20 names of people who I've already had on my show, who I know you like to some degree because you follow them, like, you're much more likely to say yes to an interview at that point.
Then what is your mental model when it comes to creating interesting content? Is it just to find your guest sweet spot? And if your guest is in the sweet spot, that will generate simultaneous energy that will spread to your audience? Or do you also have your audience in mind? Do you have your personal interest in mind? How do you create great content?
Yeah, for me, my specific, and this isn't something that I'm just like, you have to do this or else it's not going to be interesting. But for me, what the way that I define it myself is getting stuff from the guests that they don't normally talk about. So for instance, when I interviewed Gary, the founder of GameStop, he's done 40 plus podcasts in the last few months because he came out with a book recently. And when we got done with the interview, he kind of pushed the mic away and he was like, that was probably the best interview that I've done in this string of, 40 or whatever. Cause he's like, it took me about halfway through to realize like that what you were doing and where you're going with this, but you're really good at this. And it's because like we talked about these other things. And I wasn't able to get into that with like any of the other people that I talked to. And so like whenever I get that, I'm like, that is the biggest compliment for me, because I know that he did 40 of them recently, and that those 40, because they're all around a book, they're probably going to be asking the same type of questions over and over and over again, and people get on autopilot. So success for me is to get my guests off of autopilot. Like stop just giving me these same responses that you've given to the last 20 hosts. If you can listen to this same interview on 25 other shows, then why would you listen to my show? You know what I'm saying? So if you want to go get good stuff from Gary and you listen to 3 or 4 shows and they all sound the same, but you can listen to my show and it sounds completely different, you get a bunch of other stuff. It's like, I'm probably going to listen to that guy's show more than these other shows, because he tends to get stuff that most other people don't get. So that's my specific goal is it's way less about like, oh, well, what's going to go viral? What does the audience want? It's more like, how can I make this an amazing experience for the guest such that they will give me the best content that they can give me. And then, I find that the better you make the guest feel during that conversation, the more likely they are to open up, the more likely they are to give you better answers, to tell you better stories, to be more enthusiastically engaged in the conversation. And the more likely they are to be willing to connect with you afterwards, beyond just the podcast interview. So, and then, the more likely they are to promote it to their audience. Like think about it. If you've done 50 podcast interviews in 1 month and only 1 or 2 of them were like novel concepts in terms of the way the interview was being conducted, which of those 50 are you going to share with your audience, your email list, your own podcast audience, or wherever else people are following you? It's like, of course you're going to share the ones that are unique and different. You're not going to share the ones that sound the same as the other 50, especially if you're a content creator. You know what I mean? If you're a creator and you're constantly creating content around whatever marketing, and you're constant, like you have a marketing show and you talk about marketing and you write about marketing, your LinkedIn blogs are marketing and everything that you write about and talk about is marketing all the time. And you do 30 podcast appearances and 28 of them talk to you about marketing. Why would you share that person's content over your own content to your own audience? You're obviously just going to keep sharing your own content. You don't have any incentive to share somebody else's content if it says the same stuff that you say all the time. But if somebody else, talk to you about, your Ironmans, or the other things that you care about, and you don't ever get a chance to talk about that, it gets you fired up, it gets you enthusiastic, you get better content, you give better content, you feel better about the interview, you're way more likely to go to your audience and be like, guys, you got to check out this interview that I just did. We talked about a bunch of stuff I don't normally talk about. If you want to get to know me better, this is the show to listen to. You know what I mean? Like everything's better to me if I can make sure that the guest is fully engaged, present, and enthusiastic about sharing stuff, because we venture into places that they've normally not been able to venture into.
Right. So there's preparation to have many angles. There's being authentic, being in the moment, listening. But how do you also get them to open up? How do you win their trust in a very short window of time so that they're not afraid to tell you new information that they haven't shared before?
Dude, I think that's something that's less teachable than like the what to say. You know what I mean? Part of the conversation. I think it's something that's not perfected, but improved over doing as many interviews as I've done, like hundreds now. But I think it has a lot more to do with tonality and body language, which combined would be the quote unquote vibe that you're giving off, than it is even like just the questions or the way that you're phrasing the questions. Because somebody if somebody's not comfortable with you, you could have a really great phrased question that they're just not going to dive deep into. They might answer it from a surface level, but they're not going to really like get into it with you because they feel like, you're not there, or maybe they don't trust you completely or fully for whatever reason. So a lot of it's tonality, a lot of it's body language, and giving off the vibe that you're somebody that's like trustworthy, is one way. And then the other way too is to, reciprocity is a real thing. So if you can kind of, um, set the tone for the conversation by being willing to share more about you as well, but not in a way that's like overwhelming in terms of the volume of words coming out of your mouth. You know what I mean? Because at the end of the day, you're still a host. Like, it's not your job to speak for 70% of the conversation. It's your job to speak for 10 to 30% of the conversation for most hosts. So, you got to keep that in mind, but also like but you can share in the way that you're phrasing questions, in asking questions, and that, along with tonality and body language, I think makes people feel comfortable. And again, that's one of those things that I'm not 100% sure how to teach. Maybe I should look into it more, but it is like, again, one of those like compliments that I get from people that I'm very pleased with, and that I'm happy with, when they're, a fair amount of people, especially when we do in-person interviews, are just like, you're just really easy to talk to. They feel comfortable around me. But I feel that that's more of a, I try my best anyway. And I think this is, I don't think this is inauthentic to me. It's not like I'm trying from like, oh, I got to be an actor standpoint. I think that's just who I am. I'm a very genuinely curious person. I am a very genuinely like even keeled person. So I tend to not have really high highs and not have really low lows. I'm not like crazy enthusiastic and in your face and overwhelming and intimidating. I tend to come across just kind of the word that a lot of people would use to describe me would be chill. And I think that demeanor makes it easier for people to open up, if questions are phrased correctly, if there's some reciprocity that's given at the beginning, some things like that. And I think the perception too of the show already having some big names, is also helpful, because people, tend to come in and be a little bit more comfortable sharing with you if they know that, a bunch of other people who they already know, like, and trust have already sat in that chair and shared the way that you're asking them to. So it's a wild combination of things, man, I think. But at the end of the day, it's not just about the words that you say. That's for sure.
And the name of the show, Travis Makes Friends. That's pretty friendly, right? Pretty inviting, pretty
Yeah.
open. Last question I have for you is one that I've gotten myself after interviewing over 2,000 CEOs. How do you how do you flourish the seeds of insights that you have got from this podcast? Do you have external systems to have your brain convert these pieces of insights from the conversations that you had into full blown wisdom?
So, man, I wish I was more, um, intentional about doing that. I have not been, to be totally honest with you. Um, there's a friend of mine who has a company that they just started doing this like hybrid book launch model where uh, they take a ton of recordings of you if you have them available, which I have them in abundance, as do you, and they train an AI model to basically learn everything about your content. And so I've been thinking about just like running through, like, it would take a long time, but running all 900 plus episodes of my show through that to try to like collect and just like say, hey, give me all of the, top tips that have been shared when it comes to X or Y or whatever. But frankly, I have not done a great job at, keeping an external system that helps me apply the wisdom from that I gain from my own show. It's more been just like a saturation of information that can't help but seep its way into every aspect of my life.
Right. And yeah, I'm also doing that with one of my company, bookwritegpt.com. That's exactly the thing we're
Okay.
gonna do. So yeah, it's gonna be exciting because people don't want to sit down and write a book for literally 6 to 12 months of their life. So
Mm.
yeah, great business idea. I'd love to get in touch with that friend of yours. I think like
Yeah.
one answer to that personally that I've been telling people is like physical activity. When I go to the gym, is like if the seed flourishes like through a cocktail of neurochemicals in my brain, I get
Mm.
insights out of nowhere.
Okay. Yeah, I like that. I like that. I do tend to find that's true when I go for walks for sure. Yeah.
Or on this treadmill.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's pretty extreme though. Thanks to Ben Greenfield for that idea. But thanks to you, Travis. Been a cool pod. I have so much more question for you. So we'll do a round two sometime soon. Where can people find out more about you?
Yeah, so we help people get booked on podcasts at guestio.com. Guest, like be a guest, guestio.com. But for me personally, all the stuff that I'm doing, all the things I'm up to, Instagram's probably my most active channel. That's at Travis Chappell, just my first and last name, Chappell. Anything else, travischappell.com is kind of the hub that you can kind of go wherever you need to go from there. So, yeah, Travis Chappell on Instagram, shoot me DM, say what's up.